For nearly 2,000 years, one question has been deliberately silenced by religious authorities, buried beneath layers of doctrine, and relegated to whispered conversations in academic corridors. Tonight, we dare to ask what millions have wondered, but few have had the courage to explore openly. Who was the biological father of Jesus? This isn't about destroying faith or undermining belief. This is about understanding history, examining evidence, and honoring the intellectual curiosity that drives us to seek truth, even when that truth challenges everything we thought we knew. Picture this. You're holding an ancient manuscript, its papyrus yellowed with age, containing words that were never meant to survive. These documents exist. They've been found in caves, buried in desert sands, hidden in monastery walls. And many of them tell a story that differs dramatically from the version you learned in Sunday school. What if I told you that the narrative of the virgin birth, while spiritually meaningful to millions, may not be the complete historical picture? What if there were political reasons, social pressures, and theological motivations that shaped how this story was told and retold across centuries? But here's what will shock you. The question we're exploring today isn't born from skepticism or irreverence. It emerges from a growing body of historical research, archaeological discoveries, and textual analysis that suggests the origins of Christianity are far more complex than traditional teachings suggest. Consider this startling fact. The earliest Christian writings, the letters of Paul, written decades before the Gospels, never mention a virgin birth. Mark, considered by most scholars to be the earliest gospel, begins with Jesus as an adult. The detailed nativity stories appear only in Matthew and Luke, written decades after the events they describe, and even these accounts differ significantly from each other. Are you beginning to see the pattern? The closer we get to the historical Jesus, the less we hear about supernatural conception. The further we move from eyewitness accounts, the more elaborate the birth narratives become. Ancient historians understand that religious narratives often serve multiple purposes. They convey spiritual truths, establish legitimacy, fulfill prophecies, and address the political and social needs of their time. The story of Jesus' birth is no exception. Tonight we'll examine manuscripts that were excluded from the biblical canon, explore historical contexts that shaped these narratives, and investigate what contemporary scholarship reveals about the origins of Christianity's central figure. We'll look at genealogies that don't align, traditions that were suppressed, and evidence that suggests a more human, more historically grounded beginning to the Jesus story. But here's where it gets really interesting. This exploration requires intellectual honesty and emotional maturity. We're not here to mock or diminish anyone's faith. We're here to understand how ancient stories developed, how historical figures became mythologized, and how political and social forces shaped the narratives that survive today. Some of you may feel uncomfortable with these questions. That's natural. When we examine the foundations of belief systems that have shaped civilizations, emotions run deep. But remember, truth doesn't fear investigation. If something is true, it can withstand scrutiny. If it's meaningful, it remains meaningful regardless of its historical accuracy. The scholars, archaeologists, and historians whose work we'll examine tonight aren't enemies of faith. Many are believers themselves, seeking to understand their traditions more deeply. They've discovered that the real story of Jesus' origins may be even more remarkable than the traditional account, not because it's supernatural, but because it's profoundly human. We'll explore how first-century Jewish society viewed parentage and legitimacy, how Roman occupation influenced family structures, and how early Christian communities preserved different versions of the Jesus story. We'll examine why certain accounts survived while others were buried, and what this tells us about the political and theological forces that shaped early Christianity. This isn't a journey for the faint of heart. Once you begin questioning official narratives, you can't unknow what you discover. But for those ready to explore the intersection of history, archaeology, and spirituality, tonight offers a glimpse into one of history's most closely guarded secrets. The evidence we'll examine comes from multiple sources: non-canonical Gospels discovered in the 20th century, early Christian writings that preceded the official canon, historical documents from the Roman period, and archaeological discoveries that shed new light on first-century Palestine. Each piece of evidence adds to a picture that's far more complex than traditional teachings suggest. Are you ready to question everything you thought you knew? Are you prepared to discover that the historical Jesus may have had a very different origin story than the one that's been passed down for 2 millennia? Then stay with me as we embark on this investigation. Because what we're about to uncover isn't just about one man's parentage. It's about how stories become myths, how myths become doctrine, and how doctrine shapes civilizations. Tonight, we reclaim the right to ask difficult questions and seek honest answers. Why has this question been treated as forbidden territory for so long? The answer lies in understanding how religious authority structures developed and how challenging certain narratives became equivalent to challenging the foundation of institutional power. From the 4th century onward, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, questioning the divine nature of Jesus' conception became not just heretical, but politically dangerous. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE established official doctrine, and deviation from these teachings could result in exile, persecution, or death. But here's what's fascinating. Even within official church history, we find evidence of ongoing debates about Jesus' origins. Early church fathers wrote extensively defending the virgin birth narrative, which suggests they were responding to contemporary challenges to this account. If the virgin birth was universally accepted historical fact, why did it require such vigorous defense? Think about this. Why would religious leaders spend so much energy defending something that was supposedly obvious to everyone? Historical documents reveal that different Christian communities preserved different traditions about Jesus' parentage. Some emphasized his divine conception, others focused on his adoption by God at baptism, and still others maintained that his significance lay not in supernatural origins, but in his teachings and sacrifice. The suppression of alternative accounts wasn't accidental. It was systematic and deliberate. Libraries were burned, manuscripts were confiscated, and entire communities that preserved non-orthodox traditions were labeled heretical and persecuted. The winners write history, and in this case, one particular interpretation of Jesus' origins became the only acceptable version. Archaeological discoveries of the past century have revolutionized our understanding of early Christianity. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in Egypt in 1945, contained Gospels and texts that offered dramatically different perspectives on Jesus' life and origins. These weren't forgeries or late fabrications. They were genuine early Christian documents that had been buried to protect them from destruction. But here comes the most shocking part. Academic institutions have long maintained a cautious distance from these questions, not because the evidence isn't compelling, but because challenging fundamental religious narratives can be professionally and socially costly. Scholars who dare to examine these topics often face criticism, funding challenges, and accusations of bias, yet the evidence continues to accumulate. Textual analysis reveals layers of editing in the canonical Gospels. Linguistic studies show how stories evolved as they passed from Aramaic to Greek to Latin. Archaeological investigations provide context for understanding first-century Palestinian society in ways that illuminate the historical background of these narratives. The silence surrounding this question isn't just historical, it's contemporary. Modern religious institutions, understandably, prefer not to address questions that might undermine traditional teachings. Educational systems often present religious narratives as historical facts without examining the evidence. Media outlets avoid topics that might offend religious sensibilities. But times are changing. We live in an era of unprecedented access to information. Ancient texts that were once available only to scholars are now digitized and accessible online. Archaeological reports that once gathered dust in academic libraries are now published for public consumption. The tools of historical investigation that were once reserved for professionals are now available to anyone with curiosity and internet access. This democratization of knowledge means we no longer have to accept official narratives without examination. We can read the primary sources ourselves. We can examine the archaeological evidence. We can trace how stories evolved over time and understand the political, social, and theological forces that shaped them. The question of Jesus' biological parentage isn't just an academic exercise. It's a window into understanding how religious traditions develop, how political power influences religious narratives, and how historical figures become mythologized over time. It's about reclaiming our right to ask difficult questions and seek honest answers. If you're ready to explore questions that require courage to ask, subscribe now. This journey demands intellectual honesty, and you've already shown you have it by clicking on this video. We're building a community of people who believe that truth doesn't fear investigation, that faith can coexist with scholarship, and that understanding history enhances rather than diminishes the profound impact of religious narratives. Hit that subscribe button because what's coming next will challenge everything you think you know about the most famous birth in history. Let's begin our investigation, where any honest inquiry must start, with the biblical texts themselves. What do the canonical Gospels actually say about Jesus' parentage, and what do they reveal when examined through the lens of historical criticism? Here's the first bombshell. Only 2 of the 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew and Luke, contain birth narratives. Mark, widely considered the earliest Gospel, begins with Jesus as an adult. The Gospel of John, despite its theological sophistication, contains no nativity story. This absence is significant because it suggests that the birth narratives weren't part of the earliest Christian traditions. But wait, it gets even more puzzling. When we examine the genealogies provided by Matthew and Luke, we encounter immediate problems. Matthew traces Jesus' lineage through Joseph, listing 42 generations from Abraham to Jesus. Luke also traces the lineage through Joseph, but his genealogy differs dramatically from Matthew's. The names don't match, the number of generations varies, and even the grandfather of Joseph is different in each account. Here's the question that will make you rethink everything. If both Gospels affirm that Joseph wasn't Jesus' biological father, why do they provide Joseph's genealogy? Traditional explanations suggest these genealogies established Jesus' legal adoption into David's line, but this interpretation raises more questions than it answers. Ancient Jewish genealogical practices were meticulous, especially regarding messianic lineage. The fact that we have 2 completely different genealogies suggests either poor record-keeping, which was uncharacteristic of Jewish tradition, or the adaptation of existing genealogical records to fit theological narratives developed later. But here's where it gets really interesting. Matthew's birth narrative contains elements that historical scholars recognize as fulfillment theology, the shaping of narratives to correspond with Old Testament prophecies. The virgin birth serves to fulfill Isaiah's prophecy, but linguistic analysis reveals that the Hebrew word Alma in Isaiah simply means young woman, not necessarily virgin. The Greek translation that rendered this as Parthenos, virgin, occurred centuries after Isaiah was written. Are you starting to see the pattern of how stories evolved to serve later theological purposes? Luke's account, while more detailed, contains historical anachronisms that suggest it was written by someone not intimately familiar with first-century Palestinian customs. The census of Quirinius, mentioned as the reason for Joseph and Mary's journey to Bethlehem, occurred in 6th CE, approximately 10 years after the death of Herod the Great, whom Matthew places as alive during Jesus' birth. These chronological inconsistencies aren't minor details. They suggest that the birth narratives were constructed to serve theological rather than historical purposes. This doesn't diminish their spiritual significance, but it does indicate that we shouldn't read them as historical biographies. The Gospels themselves contain hints that alternative understandings of Jesus' parentage existed in early Christian communities. In John's Gospel, Jesus' opponents question his legitimacy, asking, "Aren't we right in saying that you are a Samaritan and demon-possessed?" And later, "We are not illegitimate children." These exchanges suggest that questions about Jesus' parentage were part of contemporary discourse. Here's something most people never notice. Mark's Gospel contains a curious detail that often goes unnoticed. When Jesus returns to his hometown, people refer to him as Mary's son, rather than identifying him through his father, which was standard practice in patriarchal first-century Jewish society. This unusual designation might reflect local knowledge about Jesus' actual parentage. The Gospel of Matthew addresses rumors that appear to have circulated about Jesus' birth. The narrative specifically mentions that Joseph considered divorcing Mary quietly, suggesting awareness of contemporary speculation about the circumstances of Jesus' conception. The angel's intervention in the story serves to provide divine authorization for what might otherwise have been seen as irregular circumstances. But here's the most startling evidence. Paul's letters, written decades before the Gospels, never mention a virgin birth. Paul refers to Jesus as born of a woman and born under the law, language that emphasizes his humanity rather than supernatural conception. In Romans, Paul describes Jesus as descended from David according to the flesh, which implies natural rather than miraculous parentage. The absence of virgin birth references in Paul's extensive theological writings is remarkable, given that this doctrine later became central to Christian theology. Paul discusses Jesus' death, resurrection, and divine sonship extensively, but never mentions the circumstances of his birth. This suggests either that Paul was unaware of virgin birth traditions, or that these traditions developed after his time. Early manuscript variations also provide clues about evolving beliefs regarding Jesus' parentage. Some ancient manuscripts contain textual variants that suggest alternative readings of key passages about Jesus' birth. While these variants were eventually standardized, their existence indicates that different Christian communities preserved different understandings of these events. The canonical Gospels, when examined critically, reveal layers of theological interpretation overlaid on historical traditions. Distinguishing between these layers requires careful analysis of language, cultural context, and manuscript traditions. The picture that emerges is far more complex than traditional readings suggest. These biblical evidences don't provide definitive answers about Jesus' biological parentage, but they do reveal that questions about his origins were present from the earliest stages of Christian tradition. The biblical texts themselves preserve traces of debates, doubts, and alternative explanations that continued to influence how these stories were told and retold. Beyond the canonical Gospels lie traditions preserved by communities that maintained different understandings of Jesus' origins. These alternative accounts, found in non-canonical texts and preserved through oral tradition, offer glimpses into the diversity of early Christian belief. But what if I told you that some of these suppressed traditions contain details that are more historically plausible than the official versions? The Gospel of the Hebrews, known to early church fathers but preserved only in fragments, apparently contained a different account of Jesus' conception. Early Christian writers who had access to this text mentioned that it described Jesus as the adopted Son of God, emphasizing his spiritual rather than biological relationship to the divine. Ebionite communities, Jewish Christians who maintained strict adherence to Mosaic law, preserved traditions that portrayed Jesus as the natural son of Joseph and Mary. These communities, considered heretical by later Orthodox Christianity, maintained that Jesus' significance lay not in supernatural birth, but in his perfect obedience to God's law and his anointing as Messiah at baptism. Here's what's truly fascinating. Gnostic traditions preserved in texts discovered at Nag Hammadi offered yet another perspective. Some Gnostic Gospels suggested that Jesus' true parentage was cosmic rather than earthly, emphasizing his role as a divine emanation rather than focusing on the circumstances of his physical birth. These traditions saw the virgin birth as a symbol rather than a literal event. But here comes something that will make you question everything you've been taught. Early church fathers themselves provide evidence of alternative traditions. Origen, one of the most influential early Christian theologians, was aware of Jewish traditions that claimed Jesus was the son of a Roman soldier named Panthera. While Origen rejected these claims, his detailed refutation indicates that such traditions were widespread enough to require systematic theological response. The Talmud, compiled centuries after Jesus' time but preserving earlier traditions, contains references to Yeshu ben Panthera, Jesus, son of Panthera. While these references are polemical and not historically reliable, they demonstrate that alternative accounts of Jesus' parentage circulated in Jewish communities and required Christian response. Archaeological discoveries have revealed the complexity of first-century Jewish-Christian relations and the diversity of early Christian communities. Different groups preserved different traditions about Jesus' life and significance. The eventual dominance of Orthodox interpretations shouldn't obscure the fact that early Christianity was remarkably diverse in its beliefs and practices. Syriac Christian traditions, preserved in communities that maintained Aramaic as their liturgical language, contain variations in birth narratives that differ from Greek versions. These traditions closer to Jesus' original linguistic context, sometimes preserve details that were lost or altered in Greek translations. Coptic Christian traditions from Egypt maintain oral histories that include stories about Jesus' family that differ from canonical accounts. While these traditions developed over centuries and can't be taken as historical fact, they demonstrate the diversity of beliefs about Jesus' origins that existed in different geographical regions. The Protevangelium of James, while not considered canonical, was widely read in early Christian communities and influenced artistic depictions of the Nativity for centuries. This text provides detailed accounts of Mary's background and Jesus' birth that differ significantly from Matthew and Luke. Its popularity demonstrates that alternative narratives continue to circulate and influence Christian understanding. But here's something that will blow your mind. Medieval Islamic texts, drawing on earlier Christian sources no longer extant, preserve accounts of Jesus' birth that sometimes differ from canonical versions. While these texts were written centuries after the events and reflect later theological perspectives, they may preserve echoes of early Christian traditions that were subsequently suppressed. The persistence of alternative traditions across different cultures, languages, and centuries suggests that questions about Jesus' parentage were never fully resolved in early Christian communities. Different groups preserved different memories, and these memories continued to influence belief and practice long after official doctrine was established. Modern scholarship has developed methods for analyzing how traditions evolve over time. These methods reveal that religious narratives often serve multiple functions. They preserve historical memories, establish community identity, provide theological instruction, and respond to contemporary challenges. Understanding these functions helps us appreciate why different communities preserved different accounts of the same events. The suppression of alternative traditions wasn't immediate or complete. Archaeological evidence shows that non-Orthodox Christian communities continued to flourish for centuries after the establishment of official doctrine. These communities preserved texts, traditions, and practices that provided different perspectives on early Christian history. What's your honest feeling about these alternative accounts? Have you ever wondered why certain stories survived while others disappeared? The fact that multiple traditions about Jesus' origins existed in early Christianity suggests that his parentage was a subject of ongoing discussion and debate. These weren't idle speculations. They were serious attempts by different communities to understand and explain the origins of their central figure. Share your thoughts below. Do you think these alternative traditions preserve historical memories, or do they represent later, theological developments? How do you balance respect for traditional beliefs with openness to historical investigation? Your perspective contributes to a conversation that has continued for 2 millennia and shows no signs of ending. A deeper examination of the canonical Gospels reveals the complex process by which these texts were composed and the various sources they drew upon. But what we're about to discover will shake the foundations of everything you thought you knew about how the Bible was written. Modern biblical scholarship has developed sophisticated methods for analyzing these texts that reveal layers of tradition, editing, and theological interpretation. The two-source hypothesis, accepted by most contemporary scholars, suggests that Matthew and Luke drew upon Mark's Gospel and a hypothetical source called Q, from the German Quell, meaning source. But here's the shocking revelation. This theory helps explain similarities and differences between the synoptic Gospels, but it also reveals something significant about the birth narratives. They appear to be independent additions to earlier traditions that didn't include nativity stories. Think about what this means. The earliest Christian communities were telling the Jesus story without any mention of miraculous birth. Mark's Gospel, the earliest and shortest, begins with Jesus' baptism by John. This starting point suggests that the earliest Christian communities were more concerned with Jesus' public ministry than with the circumstances of his birth. The absence of a birth narrative in Mark doesn't necessarily mean Mark was unaware of such traditions, but it does indicate they weren't considered essential to his presentation of the Jesus story. When Matthew and Luke added birth narratives to their Gospels, they drew upon different sources and served different theological purposes. Matthew's account emphasizes Jesus' fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies and his legitimacy as Messiah. Luke's account focuses on themes of divine favor, social reversal, and God's concern for the marginalized. But here's where it gets absolutely mind-blowing. The differences between these accounts aren't trivial. Matthew places the Holy Family in Bethlehem from the beginning, while Luke has them traveling there for the census. Matthew includes the visit of the Magi and the flight to Egypt, while Luke features shepherds and the presentation at the temple. These aren't complementary accounts that can be easily harmonized. They represent different theological traditions. Are you beginning to see that we're not dealing with eyewitness accounts, but with theological constructions? Source criticism reveals that both Matthew and Luke likely drew upon earlier written sources for their birth narratives. These sources may have included genealogical records, popular stories about Jesus' childhood, and theological reflections on his significance. The evangelists adapted these sources to serve their particular theological emphases. Form criticism, another tool of modern biblical scholarship, analyzes the literary genres present in the Gospels. The birth narratives contain elements of legend, midrash, Jewish interpretive storytelling, and fulfillment theology. Understanding these literary forms helps us appreciate how ancient authors communicated truth through narrative techniques that weren't necessarily intended as historical reportage. Redaction criticism examines how the Gospel writers edited their sources to convey their theological messages. Both Matthew and Luke made deliberate choices about which traditions to include, how to arrange their material, and what themes to emphasize. Their birth narratives reflect these editorial decisions rather than simple historical reporting. But here's the bombshell that changes everything. The genealogies in Matthew and Luke illustrate these editorial processes. Matthew's genealogy is carefully structured in 3 groups of 14 generations, a pattern that requires omitting certain names from Old Testament genealogical records. This mathematical structure serves Matthew's theological purpose of presenting Jesus as the fulfillment of Jewish history, but it sacrifices genealogical accuracy for theological symbolism. Luke's genealogy traces Jesus' lineage back to Adam, emphasizing his universal significance rather than specifically Jewish identity. The differences between Matthew and Luke's genealogies suggest that accurate historical records of Jesus' ancestry may not have been available to the Gospel writers, forcing them to construct genealogies that served their theological purposes. The infancy narratives also reveal the evangelists' knowledge of their audiences. Matthew's emphasis on fulfillment of prophecy and resistance to Herod's authority would have resonated with Jewish Christians concerned about legitimacy and persecution. Luke's emphasis on divine reversals and concern for the poor would have appealed to Gentile Christians familiar with Greco-Roman literary traditions. Textual criticism, the analysis of manuscript variations, reveals that the birth narratives were subject to editing and revision throughout the early centuries of Christianity. Some manuscripts contain variations that suggest scribes were uncertain about certain details or sought to harmonize conflicting accounts. But here's something that will absolutely stun you. The earliest reference to the virgin birth outside the canonical Gospels appears in the Proto-Evangelium of James, probably written in the mid-2nd century. This text provides elaborate details about Mary's background and Jesus' birth that aren't found in the canonical Gospels. Its popularity in early Christian communities demonstrates continued interest in expanding the birth narratives. The development of virgin birth doctrine can be traced through early Christian writings. The Apostolic Fathers, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries, rarely mention Jesus' birth. When they do, they emphasize his humanity rather than supernatural conception. The emphasis on virginal conception develops gradually through the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Early Christian creeds reveal this evolutionary process. The earliest creeds focus on Jesus' death and resurrection, with minimal attention to his birth. Later creeds, particularly those formulated in response to theological controversies, place greater emphasis on the circumstances of his conception. The canonical Gospels, when examined through these critical methods, reveal themselves to be sophisticated theological works that preserve historical traditions while adapting them for specific audiences and purposes. Understanding these texts as products of their time and context enhances rather than diminishes their significance, but it also cautions against reading them as straightforward historical biographies. The 20th century brought unprecedented access to early Christian texts that had been lost for over a millennium. But what these discoveries revealed about Jesus' origins is so controversial that many religious institutions still refuse to acknowledge their significance. The most significant discovery occurred in 1945 near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, where 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 texts were found buried in sealed jars. These documents, dating from the 4th century CE but preserving much earlier traditions, included Gospels, apocalypses, and theological treatises that offered dramatically different perspectives on Jesus and early Christianity. But here's the explosive revelation that will change everything you thought you knew. Among these texts, several provide alternative accounts of Jesus' conception and birth that are more historically plausible than the supernatural narratives in Matthew and Luke. The Gospel of Philip addresses questions about Jesus' parentage directly, stating, "Some said Mary conceived by the Holy Spirit. They are in error. They do not know what they are saying. When did a woman ever conceive by a woman?" This text suggests that some early Christian communities questioned virgin birth narratives and found them logically problematic. The Gospel of Thomas, which may preserve sayings traditions as early as those found in the canonical Gospels, focuses entirely on Jesus' teachings rather than biographical details. The absence of birth narratives in this early collection suggests that some Christian communities were primarily interested in Jesus' wisdom rather than the circumstances of his origins. But here comes the most shocking discovery of all. The secret book of John presents an elaborate cosmological framework that places Jesus' earthly incarnation within a complex mythological system. In this text, Jesus' human birth is less important than his role as a divine revealer who descends to liberate humanity from ignorance. This perspective emphasizes spiritual rather than biological parentage. The dialogue of the Savior portrays Mary Magdalene as one of Jesus' primary disciples, equal to or superior to the male apostles. This text suggests that some early Christian communities preserved traditions about Jesus' close relationship with women that were later suppressed or marginalized in Orthodox Christianity. Manuscript discoveries at other sites have provided additional insights. The Gospel of Peter, discovered in Egypt in 1886, contains a passion narrative that differs significantly from canonical accounts. While this text doesn't focus on Jesus' birth, its alternative presentation of his death and resurrection demonstrates the diversity of early Christian traditions. But here's what will absolutely blow your mind. The Gospel of the Hebrews, known to early church fathers but preserved only in fragments quoted by later writers, apparently contained birth narratives that differed from Matthew and Luke. Jerome, who had access to this text, mentions that it portrayed Jesus as the adopted, rather than biological Son of God. The Protevangelium of James, while not found at Nag Hammadi, represents another stream of early Christian tradition about Jesus' birth. This text, probably written in the mid-2nd century, provides elaborate details about Mary's background, her purification, and the circumstances of Jesus' birth. Interestingly, this text emphasizes Mary's perpetual virginity, but provides naturalistic details about the birth process. Infancy Gospels, popular in early Christian communities, expanded the canonical birth narratives with elaborate stories about Jesus' childhood. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas describes miraculous events from Jesus' early years, while the Arabic Infancy Gospel includes stories about the Holy Family's flight to Egypt. These texts demonstrate continued interest in Jesus' early life beyond what the canonical Gospels provided. But here's the most controversial discovery. The Gospel of the Ebionites, preserved only in quotations by early church fathers, apparently contained traditions maintained by Jewish Christian communities that emphasized Jesus' humanity and his adoption as God's Son at baptism. These communities, which maintained strict adherence to Jewish law, preserved alternative understandings of Jesus' relationship to God. Syriac Christian traditions preserved in manuscripts discovered in the 20th century contain variations on the birth narratives that differ from Greek versions. The Diatessaron, a 2nd century harmony of the 4 Gospels compiled by Tatian, reveals how early Christian communities attempted to reconcile conflicting accounts of Jesus' life. The Gospel of Mary, another Nag Hammadi text, portrays Mary Magdalene as the recipient of special revelation from the risen Jesus. While this text doesn't address Jesus' birth directly, it suggests that some early Christian communities preserved traditions about authoritative women in Jesus' circle who were later marginalized. Archaeological discoveries have provided context for understanding these texts. Excavations at early Christian sites have revealed the diversity of beliefs and practices in different geographical regions. Some communities emphasize Jesus' divinity, others his humanity, and still others his role as a wisdom teacher. But here's what they don't want you to know. The process by which certain texts became canonical while others were excluded wasn't immediate or uncontroversial. The development of the New Testament canon occurred over several centuries and involved complex theological, political, and practical considerations. Many texts that were eventually excluded were widely read and respected in early Christian communities. Modern critical scholarship has developed methods for dating these texts and understanding their relationships to canonical writings. Some non-canonical texts preserve traditions that may be as early as those found in the canonical Gospels. Others represent later theological developments that reflect evolving Christian understanding. The significance of these discoveries extends beyond academic interest. They demonstrate that early Christianity was far more diverse than traditional church history suggests. Different communities preserved different memories of Jesus and developed different theological interpretations of his significance. These texts don't provide definitive answers about Jesus' biological parentage, but they do reveal that questions about his origins were part of ongoing discussion in early Christian communities. Some communities emphasized supernatural conception, others natural birth followed by divine adoption, and still others focused on spiritual rather than biological relationships. The suppression of these alternative traditions wasn't accidental. As Christianity became institutionalized and aligned with imperial power, diversity of belief was seen as threatening to unity and authority. Texts that preserved alternative traditions were excluded from the canon and eventually banned or destroyed. The recovery of these texts in the 20th century provides an opportunity to understand early Christianity in its full complexity and diversity. They remind us that the development of Christian doctrine was a gradual process involving debate, controversy, and the eventual triumph of particular interpretations over others. Understanding first-century Palestine requires examining the complex social, political, and cultural forces that shaped daily life in Jesus' time. This context provides crucial background for evaluating different accounts of his origins. Roman occupation had profoundly altered Palestinian Jewish society by the 1st century CE. Since Pompey's conquest of Jerusalem in 63 BCE, Jewish communities had lived under foreign rule that fundamentally changed social structures, economic relationships, and cultural practices. The presence of Roman soldiers throughout Palestine created complex social dynamics. Archaeological evidence reveals that Roman military units were stationed in major cities and along important trade routes. These soldiers, primarily recruited from other parts of the empire, interacted with local populations in various ways, some coercive, others consensual. Marriage customs in 1st century Jewish society were strictly regulated by religious law and social convention. Betrothal was a formal legal arrangement that created binding obligations between families. The discovery that a betrothed woman was pregnant by someone other than her intended husband created serious legal and social complications. But here's what changes everything. The concept of mamzer, often translated as bastard, had specific legal meaning in Jewish law. Children born from forbidden relationships faced restrictions on marriage and participation in religious communities. These social realities would have made questions about Jesus' parentage significant for his standing in 1st century Jewish society. Roman legal traditions regarding citizenship, inheritance, and legitimacy differed from Jewish customs. Children born to Roman soldiers and local women occupied a complex legal status that varied depending on circumstances. Some achieved Roman citizenship through their fathers, while others remained local subjects. The Herodian dynasty, ruling under Roman authority, represented a fusion of Jewish tradition and Greco-Roman culture. The Herods maintained Jewish religious observances while adopting Roman administrative practices and architectural styles. This cultural synthesis created tensions within Jewish society. Religious diversity characterized 1st century Judaism more than many modern people realize. Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and other groups maintained different interpretations of Jewish law and different expectations about the coming Messiah. The presence of Gentiles throughout Palestine, whether as Roman administrators, Greek traders, or other immigrants, created multicultural environments in many towns and cities. Galilee, where Jesus spent most of his life, was particularly cosmopolitan, with significant non-Jewish populations. Archaeological excavations have revealed the material culture of first-century Palestine. Roman artifacts, including coins, pottery, and architectural elements, appear alongside Jewish religious objects in domestic contexts. This archaeological record demonstrates the complex cultural mixing that characterized the period. Trade routes connecting Palestine to other parts of the Roman Empire brought constant contact with foreign cultures, ideas, and peoples. Nazareth, despite its small size, was located near major trade routes that connected it to larger regional networks. Social mobility was possible, but limited under Roman rule. Some individuals achieved prominence through military service, trade, or religious leadership. However, birth circumstances continued to influence life opportunities and social standing. The role of women in first-century Palestinian society was complex and varied by social class and religious community. While patriarchal structures dominated, women sometimes exercised significant influence within families and religious communities. The expectation of messianic intervention was widespread in first-century Jewish communities, though different groups held different concepts of what the Messiah would accomplish. Some expected a political liberator, others a religious reformer, and still others a cosmic figure who would transform the world order. This complex historical context suggests that questions about Jesus' parentage would have had social, legal, and religious implications that extended far beyond simple curiosity. Understanding these dynamics helps explain why different communities preserved different traditions about his origins and why these questions remained contentious throughout early Christian history. The historical record from this period, while incomplete, provides enough detail to understand the social forces that would have shaped how stories about Jesus' birth were told, received, and transmitted across generations and geographical boundaries. Contemporary scholarship has developed increasingly sophisticated methods for analyzing ancient texts and historical evidence. These academic approaches apply the same critical methods used to study other ancient literature and historical figures. But what modern scholars have discovered about Jesus' origins is so controversial that it rarely makes it into mainstream religious education. Historical critical methodology examines biblical texts as historical documents produced in specific cultural contexts. This approach analyzes language, literary genres, manuscript traditions, and archaeological evidence to understand how these texts were composed and what they reveal about their historical periods. Source criticism has identified multiple layers of tradition within the gospel narratives. Scholars have traced how oral traditions were collected, edited, and adapted for different audiences. The birth narratives in Matthew and Luke appear to draw upon different source materials, suggesting that multiple traditions about Jesus' origins circulated in early Christian communities. Contemporary scholarship has developed increasingly sophisticated methods for analyzing ancient texts and historical evidence. These academic approaches apply the same critical methods used to study other ancient literature and historical figures. But what modern scholars have discovered about Jesus' origins is so controversial that it rarely makes it into mainstream religious education. Historical critical methodology examines biblical texts as historical documents produced in specific cultural contexts. This approach analyzes language, literary genres, manuscript traditions, and archaeological evidence to understand how these texts were composed and what they reveal about their historical periods. Source criticism has identified multiple layers of tradition within the gospel narratives. Scholars have traced how oral traditions were collected, edited, and adapted for different audiences. The birth narratives in Matthew and Luke appear to draw upon different source materials, suggesting that multiple traditions about Jesus' origins circulated in early Christian communities. Form criticism analyzes the literary genres present in biblical texts. The infancy narratives contain elements of legend, folklore, and theological reflection that were common in ancient biographical writing. Understanding these literary conventions helps scholars distinguish between historical reporting and theological interpretation. But here's what will shock you about modern academic findings. Redaction criticism examines how gospel writers edited their sources to convey specific theological messages. Both Matthew and Luke made deliberate choices about which traditions to include and how to present them. Their birth narratives reflect these editorial decisions rather than simple historical compilation. Archaeological investigations have provided crucial context for understanding first-century Palestinian society. Excavations at Nazareth, Bethlehem, and other sites mentioned in the Gospels have revealed information about population sizes, cultural practices, and social structures that illuminate the historical background of these narratives. Linguistic analysis of the Gospels reveals layers of translation and transmission. The birth narratives contain Greek translations of Aramaic traditions, and scholars can sometimes identify where translation choices affected meaning. The famous Virgin translation of Isaiah's Alma represents one such example. Comparative religious studies have identified parallels between Christian birth narratives and similar stories in other ancient cultures. While these parallels don't prove dependence or borrowing, they demonstrate that supernatural birth stories were common ways of expressing significance in the ancient world. Here's something that will make you question everything. Social scientific criticism applies insights from anthropology and sociology to understand ancient texts. This approach examines how honor, shame, kinship, and social status functioned in first-century Mediterranean societies. Questions about Jesus' parentage would have had significant social implications in such contexts. Feminist biblical scholarship has highlighted how women's voices and experiences were marginalized in traditional interpretations. This approach examines how patriarchal assumptions may have influenced how stories about Mary and other women were told and preserved. Post-colonial criticism analyzes how biblical interpretation has been influenced by power relationships and cultural assumptions. This approach is particularly relevant for understanding how Roman colonial context affected the development and preservation of different traditions about Jesus' origins. Recent advances in manuscript studies have provided new insights into textual variations and transmission. Digital imaging technologies allow scholars to examine ancient manuscripts in unprecedented detail, sometimes revealing previously unknown textual variants or editorial changes. But here's where it gets really fascinating. Psychological approaches to biblical interpretation examine how memory, trauma, and cultural identity influence how communities preserve and transmit stories. These insights help explain why different groups might maintain different traditions about the same events. Statistical analysis of ancient texts has revealed patterns in vocabulary, style, and content that help scholars identify sources and trace transmission. These quantitative methods complement traditional literary analysis and provide additional tools for understanding textual development. Before we continue this investigation, I'm curious, from which corner of the world are you joining this exploration? Your perspective adds to this global conversation about ancient mysteries. Whether you're watching from Sao Paulo or Stockholm, from Cairo or Calgary, your engagement demonstrates that questions about historical truth transcend geographical and cultural boundaries. Are you starting to see how this investigation connects people across continents who are hungry for truth? Academic institutions worldwide have contributed to this research. Universities in Europe, North America, the Middle East, and elsewhere have supported archaeological excavations, manuscript studies, and critical analysis that advances our understanding of early Christianity. This truly international scholarly community continues to uncover new evidence and develop new methods for historical investigation. The diversity of scholarly perspectives enriches this investigation. Researchers from different cultural backgrounds, religious traditions, and methodological approaches contribute unique insights that advance our collective understanding. Jewish scholars, Christian theologians, secular historians, and scholars from other religious traditions all contribute to this ongoing conversation. Contemporary scholarship maintains careful distinctions between historical investigation and theological interpretation. Academic research focuses on what can be determined through critical analysis of evidence, while acknowledging that questions of faith and meaning extend beyond historical inquiry. But here's the bombshell. The results of this academic research don't provide simple answers about Jesus' biological parentage, but they do clarify the complexity of the evidence and the various factors that influenced how different traditions developed. This scholarly work demonstrates that early Christianity was far more diverse than traditional presentations suggest. Modern universities offer courses that examine these questions using critical methodologies. Students can study early Christian literature, archaeology, and history in ways that previous generations couldn't access. This democratization of scholarly tools means that curious individuals can engage with primary sources and archaeological evidence directly. The academic study of early Christianity continues to evolve as new discoveries are made and new methods are developed. Recent archaeological finds, manuscript discoveries, and technological advances in analysis ensure that our understanding of this period continues to develop. This scholarly approach doesn't seek to undermine faith or tradition, but rather to understand how religious narratives develop and function within historical contexts. Many scholars working in this field are themselves believers who see their research as deepening rather than threatening their faith. The question of Jesus' biological parentage raises profound theological questions that different religious traditions have addressed in various ways, but what we're about to explore will fundamentally transform how you understand the relationship between faith and historical truth. Traditional Christian theology has emphasized the virgin birth as essential to understanding Jesus' divine nature. The doctrine of the Incarnation, developed through centuries of theological reflection, presents Jesus as both fully divine and fully human. Virgin birth narratives have been interpreted as explaining how divine and human natures could unite in one person. But here's what will revolutionize your understanding. Theological diversity exists even within traditional Christianity regarding these questions. Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Protestant traditions have developed different emphases in their understanding of the Incarnation. Some theological traditions focus more on Jesus' baptism or resurrection as moments of divine revelation rather than his conception. Early Christian communities held various beliefs about Jesus' relationship to God. Adoptionist Christians believed that Jesus became God's Son through divine adoption, typically at his baptism. This view, while later considered heretical, was maintained by some early Christian communities and doesn't require supernatural conception. Are you beginning to see that divine sonship doesn't necessarily depend on miraculous birth? Gnostic Christian traditions emphasize spiritual rather than biological relationships. In these interpretations, Jesus' significance lay in his role as revealer of divine knowledge rather than in the circumstances of his physical birth. These communities often viewed the material world as less important than spiritual realities. Contemporary liberation theology has examined how emphasis on supernatural birth might distract from Jesus' message of social justice and concern for the oppressed. Some liberation theologians argue that focusing on miraculous conception can obscure the radical nature of Jesus' teachings about economic inequality and political oppression. But here's the transformative revelation. Feminist theology has questioned how virgin birth doctrines affect understanding of women's roles and sexuality. Some feminist theologians argue that emphasis on Mary's virginity perpetuates harmful attitudes about women's bodies and sexuality, while others find empowering elements in Mary's active consent to divine purpose. Process theology, which emphasizes God's involvement in natural processes rather than supernatural intervention, offers alternative ways of understanding divine presence in Jesus' life. This theological approach sees God working through natural means rather than bypassing them. Different Christian denominations maintain varying levels of emphasis on virgin birth doctrine. While most traditional churches affirm this teaching, some progressive Christian communities focus more on Jesus' teachings and example than on the circumstances of his birth. These communities often emphasize Jesus' moral and spiritual significance rather than metaphysical claims about his conception. Interfaith dialogue has highlighted how different religious traditions understand divine involvement in human affairs. Islamic tradition affirms Jesus' virgin birth while maintaining different theological conclusions about his nature. Jewish perspectives generally emphasize Jesus' humanity while respecting him as a teacher or prophet. But here's what will completely change your perspective. Contemporary theology grapples with how to integrate historical critical scholarship with traditional beliefs. Some theologians argue that historical accuracy isn't necessary for theological truth, while others seek to ground theological claims in historical evidence. This ongoing conversation continues to evolve as new evidence emerges. Mystical traditions within Christianity have often emphasized direct spiritual experience over historical claims. These approaches focus on encountering the living Christ rather than debating the circumstances of his birth. Such traditions suggest that spiritual truth transcends historical questions. The doctrine of the virgin birth intersects with broader questions about the relationship between faith and reason. Some believers see rational inquiry as threatening to faith, while others view critical thinking as compatible with or even essential to mature faith. These different approaches lead to different ways of handling questions about Jesus' origins. Theological education in many institutions now includes critical study of biblical texts alongside traditional theological interpretation. Seminary students learn historical critical methods while also studying systematic theology and pastoral care. This integrated approach helps future religious leaders navigate questions about history and faith. Contemporary Christian worship and liturgy continue to include references to virgin birth narratives, even in communities where leaders privately hold more nuanced views about their historical accuracy. This tension between public tradition and private scholarship creates complex dynamics within religious communities. But here's the most profound realization. The implications of these questions extend beyond Christianity to broader conversations about religious authority, scriptural interpretation, and the relationship between tradition and truth. Different communities handle these tensions in various ways, from strict traditionalism to progressive reinterpretation. Some theological perspectives suggest that the truth of religious narratives lies in their meaning and impact, rather than their historical accuracy. This approach allows communities to maintain traditional practices while acknowledging scholarly insights about textual development and historical context. The question of Jesus' biological parentage ultimately connects to fundamental questions about the nature of God, the meaning of human existence, and the relationship between divine and natural reality. Different answers to these questions lead to different theological systems and spiritual practices. Modern theology increasingly recognizes the diversity of early Christian beliefs and the gradual development of orthodox doctrine. This historical awareness allows for more nuanced understanding of how theological beliefs develop and change over time. These theological implications don't require choosing between faith and scholarship, but rather invite deeper exploration of how historical understanding can inform and enrich spiritual life. Many believers find that scholarly investigation enhances rather than threatens their faith by providing richer context for understanding ancient texts and traditions. Throughout history, communities and individuals have taken extraordinary risks to preserve alternative accounts of Jesus' origins and early Christian diversity. Their stories illuminate both the power of institutional control and the persistence of human curiosity about suppressed truths. But what you're about to learn about these preservation efforts will absolutely astound you. The Library of Alexandria, before its gradual decline and destruction, housed countless texts that preserved diverse traditions about early Christianity. Scholars who worked there had access to documents that would later be lost or deliberately destroyed. Some evidence suggests that alternative gospels and early Christian writings were systematically removed or destroyed as orthodox doctrine became established. Christian communities in Egypt developed sophisticated methods for preserving texts that might be considered heretical. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945, represents one such preservation effort. But here's what will blow your mind. Monks at a nearby monastery apparently buried these texts in sealed jars to protect them from destruction during the late 4th century, when official Christianity was aggressively suppressing alternative traditions. The preservation methods used at Nag Hammadi reveal careful planning and dedication. The texts were copied onto papyrus, bound in leather covers, and sealed in ceramic jars designed to protect them from moisture and decay. This process required significant resources and demonstrated the importance these communities placed on preserving alternative traditions. Coptic Christian communities in Egypt maintained traditions and texts that differed from Greek and Latin Christianity. Their geographical isolation and distinct language helped preserve alternative perspectives that might otherwise have been suppressed. Some of these traditions included different accounts of Jesus' origins and family relationships, but here's something that will shock you to your core. Syrian Christian communities preserved Aramaic traditions that remained closer to Jesus' original linguistic context. The Peshitta, the standard Aramaic Bible of Syriac Christianity, contains variations from Greek texts that sometimes preserve earlier readings. These communities maintained oral traditions alongside written texts. Irish monastic communities played a crucial role in preserving ancient texts during the European Dark Ages. Their scriptoriums copied and preserved manuscripts that might otherwise have been lost. Some of these monasteries maintained libraries that included non-canonical texts and alternative Christian traditions. The Cathars, a medieval Christian movement in southern France, preserved traditions that emphasize spiritual rather than institutional authority. Their beliefs about Jesus' nature and origins differed from Orthodox teaching. The violent suppression of Cathar communities in the 13th century eliminated not only people, but also their texts and traditions. Jewish communities preserved traditions about Jesus that differed from Christian accounts. While these traditions were often polemical and not historically reliable, they demonstrate that alternative narratives about Jesus' origins continued to circulate outside Christian communities. Here's what will completely revolutionize your understanding. Islamic preservation of early Christian texts provides another avenue for understanding suppressed traditions. Early Islamic scholars had access to Christian texts that were later lost in Christian communities. Some Islamic accounts of Jesus' birth preserve elements that may reflect early Christian traditions no longer found in Orthodox sources. The invention of printing in the 15th century revolutionized the preservation of alternative texts. Previously suppressed works could now be reproduced and distributed more widely. The Protestant Reformation created new opportunities for examining early Christian sources and questioning traditional interpretations. Renaissance humanists developed new methods for studying ancient texts and recovering lost works. Their scholarly approach to biblical interpretation laid groundwork for later historical critical methodology. These scholars sometimes discovered and preserved texts that revealed the diversity of early Christian traditions. The Enlightenment brought new emphasis on rational inquiry and historical investigation. Scholars began applying critical methods to religious texts and questioning traditional narratives. This intellectual movement created space for examining suppressed evidence about early Christianity. But here's the most amazing part. Archaeological discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries provided new sources of information about early Christian diversity. Excavations in Egypt, Palestine, and other regions uncovered texts, inscriptions, and artifacts that illuminated alternative traditions that had been suppressed or forgotten. Modern digital technology has revolutionized the preservation and accessibility of ancient texts. Manuscripts that were previously available only to specialists can now be examined by anyone with internet access. Digital preservation ensures that these texts won't be lost to political or religious suppression. Academic freedom in modern universities has created protected spaces for investigating questions that might be controversial in religious contexts. Scholars can examine evidence and publish findings without fear of persecution, though they may still face professional or social consequences for challenging traditional beliefs. International scholarly collaboration has accelerated the recovery and analysis of suppressed traditions. Researchers from different countries and religious backgrounds contribute diverse perspectives that advance collective understanding of early Christian history. The Internet has democratized access to information about suppressed Christian traditions. Texts that were once available only in specialized libraries are now accessible to general audiences. This democratization of knowledge makes it increasingly difficult to suppress alternative accounts or maintain official narratives without challenge. Contemporary preservation efforts continue this ancient tradition of protecting diverse perspectives. Digital archives, scholarly editions, and popular publications ensure that evidence about early Christian diversity remains available for future investigation. These preservation efforts remind us that truth has always required courage to seek and protect. The people who risked their lives to preserve alternative accounts of Jesus' origins believed that diversity of thought and freedom of inquiry were worth defending, even at great personal cost. We live in an unprecedented era of access to information about early Christianity and the historical Jesus. The tools and sources that were once available only to specialized scholars are now accessible to anyone with curiosity and internet access. This democratization of knowledge has sparked what many observers describe as a global spiritual awakening. But what's happening right now goes far beyond simple access to information. It's a fundamental shift in human consciousness. The digital age has transformed how people engage with religious questions. Online databases provide access to ancient manuscripts, archaeological reports, and scholarly research that were previously confined to university libraries. Social media platforms enable global conversations about topics that were once discussed only in academic circles. Contemporary spiritual movements increasingly emphasize direct experience over institutional authority. Many people are exploring early Christian texts, meditation practices, and mystical traditions that bypass traditional religious hierarchies. This trend toward spiritual independence creates openness to alternative accounts of Christian origins. The questioning of authority that characterizes our era extends beyond politics and media to include religious institutions. Younger generations in particular approach traditional teachings with healthy skepticism and demand evidence-based explanations. This critical attitude creates space for examining suppressed aspects of early Christian history. But here's what's truly extraordinary about this moment. Global communication has connected people across religious and cultural boundaries in ways that previous generations couldn't imagine. Someone watching this video in São Paulo can engage in real-time discussion with viewers in Stockholm, Cairo, or Chennai about ancient manuscripts discovered in Egypt. This global dialogue enriches our collective understanding of early Christian diversity. Archaeological discoveries continue to provide new insights into early Christian history. Recent excavations in Palestine, ongoing analysis of the Nag Hammadi texts, and new manuscript discoveries ensure that our understanding of early Christianity continues to evolve. Each new finding adds pieces to the complex puzzle of Christian origins. The environmental crisis has led many people to seek more earth-centered spiritualities that emphasize divine presence in nature rather than supernatural intervention. This spiritual shift creates openness to understanding Jesus as a wisdom teacher and social revolutionary, rather than primarily as a supernatural figure born through miraculous conception. Contemporary psychology and neuroscience have provided new ways of understanding religious experience and the development of religious narratives. These insights help explain how communities create and preserve stories that serve psychological and social functions beyond historical accuracy. But here's what makes this awakening so powerful. The study of mythology and comparative religion has become more accessible through popular books, documentaries, and online resources. People can now easily explore parallels between Christian narratives and similar stories in other religious traditions, leading to more nuanced understanding of how religious stories develop. Women's liberation movements have encouraged re-examination of religious traditions that marginalized female voices and experiences. This feminist awakening has sparked new interest in figures like Mary Magdalene and other women in Jesus' circle who were minimized in traditional accounts. Social justice movements have highlighted how religious narratives can be used to maintain or challenge existing power structures. This awareness creates interest in recovering the revolutionary aspects of Jesus' message that may have been suppressed by later institutional Christianity. The New Age movement, despite its diverse and sometimes uncritical elements, has introduced millions of people to esoteric traditions, mystical experiences, and alternative religious narratives. This spiritual experimentation has created openness to questioning traditional religious teachings. Scientific advances in archaeology, linguistics, and textual analysis continue to provide new tools for understanding ancient texts and historical contexts. Carbon dating, DNA analysis, and digital imaging reveal information about ancient manuscripts and artifacts that previous generations couldn't access. But here's the most transformative aspect of our current moment. Interfaith dialogue has become more common and sophisticated. creating opportunities for people from different religious backgrounds to share perspectives on common questions. These conversations often reveal shared concerns and complementary insights that enrich understanding. The Internet has enabled the formation of global communities united by shared interests rather than geographical proximity or traditional affiliations. Online groups dedicated to studying early Christianity, mystical traditions, or historical Jesus research connect like-minded individuals across continents. Alternative media platforms have provided spaces for discussing topics that mainstream media might avoid due to religious sensitivities. Podcasts, independent documentaries, and online publications offer perspectives that might not appear in traditional religious or academic contexts. The current era of information abundance creates both opportunities and challenges. While more information is available than ever before, evaluating sources and distinguishing reliable scholarship from speculation requires critical thinking skills that not everyone possesses. This moment in history offers unprecedented opportunities for understanding early Christian diversity and the historical development of religious traditions. However, it also requires wisdom, discernment, and respect for the genuine spiritual needs that religious traditions serve, regardless of their historical accuracy. The awakening happening today isn't just about recovering suppressed historical information, it's about reclaiming the right to ask difficult questions, seek honest answers, and construct meaning that serves contemporary spiritual needs while honoring ancient wisdom. Our investigation into the question of Jesus' biological parentage has taken us through ancient manuscripts, archaeological discoveries, scholarly research, and diverse religious traditions. What have we learned from this extraordinary journey into one of history's most closely guarded secrets? First, we've discovered that early Christianity was far more diverse than traditional presentations suggest. Different communities preserved different traditions about Jesus' origins, and the eventual dominance of virgin birth doctrine shouldn't obscure the fact that alternative accounts existed and were seriously maintained by some early Christians. Second, we've seen that the canonical Gospels themselves contain tensions, inconsistencies, and gaps that suggest their birth narratives serve theological rather than primarily historical purposes. This doesn't diminish their spiritual significance, but it does caution against reading them as straightforward biographical accounts. Third, we've examined how political, social, and religious forces shaped which traditions survived and which were suppressed. The development of Christian doctrine was a gradual process involving human decisions about which interpretations would be considered orthodox and which would be marginalized. But here's the most profound realization. We've learned that seeking truth about sacred subjects is itself a sacred act. The people who preserved alternative traditions about Jesus' origins, often at great personal risk, believed that truth was worth pursuing regardless of institutional pressure to conform. This investigation doesn't provide definitive answers about Jesus' biological parentage. The historical evidence is incomplete, and honest scholarship requires acknowledging uncertainty where certainty isn't possible. However, our exploration has revealed that questions about Jesus' origins were part of ongoing discussion in early Christian communities and remain legitimate subjects for contemporary investigation. The diversity of early Christian traditions suggests that authentic faith doesn't require accepting every traditional claim without examination. Many believers throughout history have found that honest inquiry enhances rather than threatens their spiritual life by providing richer understanding of how religious traditions develop and function. Whether Jesus was conceived through divine intervention, natural means, or circumstances we can no longer determine historically, his impact on human history remains undeniable. The movements he inspired, the communities that formed around his teachings, and the ongoing quest for meaning and justice that his story represents continue to shape our world. You've just participated in an investigation that required intellectual courage and spiritual maturity. You've demonstrated that you're part of a growing global community that believes truth doesn't fear investigation, that faith can coexist with scholarship, and that understanding history enhances rather than diminishes the profound impact of religious narratives. If this exploration opened new pathways of thought for you, subscribe now and join thousands of others who are committed to seeking truth wherever it leads. We're building something revolutionary here, a community of people who refuse to accept easy answers to complex questions. Click on the next video that appears on your screen to continue this journey into the hidden chapters of ancient history. There are many more mysteries waiting to be investigated, many more questions that deserve honest examination, and many more opportunities to deepen our understanding of the complex relationship between history, faith, and meaning. Thank you for watching this video until the end. See you in the next video.